Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Freedom Factor. So, yesterday was Columbus Day, and I wanted to address the explorer in the room. See, every year we see the same back and forth. Progressives, typically, denouncing the celebration of the late 15th century achievements of that famed explorer, and people, mostly on the right, celebrating the fact that Columbus's discovery ushered in a new era of European exploration that led to the bringing of Western civilization to the New World, which then precipitated the foundation of the United States of America. And to the haters of Columbus, one thing I will say is you wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for that. But I digress. Let's address some of the issues surrounding this topic. First and foremost, we'll all acknowledge Columbus didn't discover America. There were people already here. He discovered it for Europe. But he also didn't even land on what we know as the American continent. He took 3 trips, which back then was really no small feat considering how primitive seafaring navigation was back then. And all 3 times he found himself in the Caribbean. So he never actually set foot on America, quote unquote. He first landed on what the indigenous people called, and forgive me if I butcher this, Guanahani. But he named it San Salvador. It's an island in the Bahamas. It's about 375 miles southeast of Miami. And it was inhabited by Bahaman natives known as the Taino. Very different people from the various tribes that we consider Native American that we speak about today. Later, he would land on the island of Dominica, just south of Antigua, much further south than San Salvador. And also, he would find himself on Hispaniola, which is what is modern-day Haiti and Dominican Republic. But not once did Columbus actually set foot on the American mainland. There's even a famous meme that makes its rounds every single year showing a Native American woman flipping off the camera saying F Columbus, but he never actually encountered what we would consider to be like the Native Americans. And yet so many Native Americans just decry him as this evil, murderous, tyrannical person. But was he really? I mean, it's no secret that Columbus, like many Europeans, or any conqueror across the world, took captives and subjugated those weaker than them. And while Columbus should not be celebrated for this behavior, and I fully acknowledge that, it's hardly the sole aspect of the man in which we judge him. He is credited with the start of the eventual migration of Europeans to the New World, and without which would have delayed settlement here, because eventually someone from Europe would have come over and found all of this land. And this would eventually lead to the creation of what we now know as the United States. So all in all, probably a good thing. But what Columbus did was no different than what the multitude of Native American tribes had been doing for hundreds, if not thousands of years before Europeans arrived. And let's not act as if the Aztec and Mayan people were these peaceful, friendly people. They captured and enslaved less powerful tribes, and they also committed countless human sacrifices. And I'm not talking a few. We're talking by the tens of thousands. And that only stopped when the Spanish conquistadors arrived and put an end to it. The slaughter and human sacrifice will not continue. But again, they also conquered the native populations and subjugated them, and I'm not excusing that behavior. I'm just pointing out that that was what was done back then. And all across the globe, mind you. From Asia to the Middle East, Africa, and yes, even North and South America long before October of 1492. So let's try and not act like, all of a sudden, it's bad. Bottom line, I mean, we're being hostile and critical of Europeans when they do it, but completely ignoring the fact that the Cherokee, the Apaches, the Aztecs, and Tainos did it. Nearly every culture on Earth did plenty of acts of what we would consider immoral and wrong by today's standards, from enslavement to seizing land to outright murder and yes, even genocide. But somehow when it's Europeans doing it, it's especially bad. Give me a break. And then there's this meme going that circled yesterday that I found stating how the Vikings got here first, long before Columbus, which is true, about 500 years prior, and that they didn't conquer, they didn't murder, and they didn't steal any land. Well, it's not entirely true. They did establish a settlement in Newfoundland, and they did engage in hostilities with the natives, suspected to be the Inuit people, to the point where they literally got out of their longboats and were attacked. And an arrow would eventually lead to the death of their leader, Thorvald Eriksson, who basically wrote in his journal that the arrow struck him, and they faced these hostile people. And this ongoing conflict would continue for several years, to the point where the Vikings were faced with annihilation, and they failed multiple times to be peaceful with them. And they were eventually forced to abandon the colony and return home. So no, they didn't steal any land, at least not permanently, but they did establish a colony there for a couple years. But by all accounts, the settlement of Europeans on the American mainland was not an overly negative thing. Yes, bad things happened. I'll acknowledge that. But it was just a continuation of what people did at that time. Migrate, settle, conquer, expand. Everyone did it. Does it make it right? Maybe, maybe not. The natives on this continent, by all anthropological accounts, were about 5,000 years behind that of the Europeans and most of Asia. If Europeans hadn't come here, this continent would still be about 4,500 years behind the rest of the world. Another fact no one wants to acknowledge: while there was still plenty of warfare and bloodshed in Europe in the 14 and 1500s, it wasn't as if there were groups constantly raiding, murdering, and enslaving people all over. Society was a bit more civilized, commerce was pretty common, and technology was on the rise. Europeans were bathing in water heated over open flame, while many tribes of North America were basically bathing in the blood of their rivals. They didn't have an organized society, and they didn't even have a written language. But the fact remains, the natives on American soil had settled here when they migrated from Asia thousands of years prior. So how far back do we say someone is quote-unquote native? I was born in America. Both my parents and my grandparents were born here. Does that not make me native to this land? We may not be First People, as they're called in Canada. Our family lineage is not indigenous to North America. And, my family comes from Scotland, Ireland, and Germany. But if we're not welcome on this land, where do we go? I've never been to Scotland or Ireland. Would they even welcome me as one of their own? What about the extensive population of descendants of the African slave trade? Should they be returned to Africa? How? Where? Would they be given housing, jobs, or even citizenship? If the land, in fact, is stolen, then how far do we go with that idea? Do we give North Africa back to Italy because the Romans were forced from there when the Caliphate invaded? What about Israel? Are they not entitled to their ancestral homeland that was taken from them by the Arabs? Surely we should force everyone out of the UK who doesn't have Saxon ancestral heritage, right? We're only using the same logic. Besides, we don't wave Confederate flags because that's quote-unquote celebrating the losers, but it's different when we celebrate the conquered indigenous people? Or do we just not celebrate the losers we don't approve of? Anyway, Columbus Day should be a day to remember the benefits that came from the exploration that led to the European settlement of this land, and the creation of a functioning and thriving society. But we also shouldn't forget the bad things that happened and endeavor to do better. While it's deeply tragic that the Native Americans were subjected to horrific atrocities, it's important to remember for that era of human history that's simply what happened. We've moved on from there. We're no longer, typically, people who conquer other people in the same way that they did 500 years ago. Some exceptions do occur, yes, I'll acknowledge that. But modern civil society doesn't engage in what it did back then, today. And I will say, I understand, look, this is not a dig. I have Native friends. They are great people. I will say, though, that you give them these lands, and they've not thrived. Even with modern technology, they've been invited to, and I know several Native Americans that live amongst us, that live within our society. They're not they're not relegated to the reservations. But if you look at life on the reservations, it's pretty bad. I mean, reservations are not exactly these beacons of, this great society that's superior to the rest of us. And there are factors that contribute to that. I will acknowledge that. Yes, they are not given the proper resources. The land is typically not very fertile. It's not very nice there. But hundreds of years and they haven't been able to overcome and thrive is kind of telling. But anyway, I digress. We'll acknowledge that, that behavior back then is not good or moral, but at times conquest does lead to advancement, so we must take the good with the bad, because ultimately it can be said that the founding of the United States overall has led to more good in the world. And since we can't change the past, we can learn from it and strive to do better moving forward and be better people to one another. So that's all I really wanted to say today. I just think that this whole decrying Columbus Day or calling it Indigenous Peoples Day is counterproductive. While people celebrate the achievements of Columbus and the founding of, or I guess the general expansion of European society onto the New World, and then, from there, despite all the negative things that happened, and believe me, there were a lot of negative things that happened, there was also a lot of good things that happened. I mean, if you really think about it, modern industrial society was birthed from that. And we've, as a people, advanced leaps and bounds. I mean, if you really think about it, I don't know if between the shared ideas between Europe and America, I don't know if we would have the society we have today, the innovations, the technology, the medical advancements that we have today without that. Because it's not all 100%, America founded all this stuff and created all this stuff. No, it was kind of a cooperative between America and Europe throughout the 18 and 1900s that led to what we consider today to be modern society. And love it or not, modern society has yielded a ton of benefits between medical, travel, commerce, innovation. Hell, the internet. I wouldn't be talking to you right now without the innovations of modern society that all stem from European settlement of North America. So, just wanted to say a few things on that. It's not a dig on people. I love people. I love the Native American populace and all that, but the bitterness and the racism and the abject hatred that, this Columbus person was so bad. And it's like, you know what? He may have done some bad things, but in the end, it's time to move on. We don't celebrate him for the bad that he did. We celebrate him for the good that he did. And while we don't forget the bad, you won't let us forget the bad, we also can kind of move on and focus on more of the good. Because in reality, everybody has some sort of bad, negative aspect to their life. And while we don't celebrate that about them, we do celebrate the good. We don't celebrate, George Washington owning slaves, but we do celebrate him founding this nation. And so you've got to take the good with the bad in equal measure, and I don't know, maybe try and see the positive in things. So that's all I've got for today. You all take care.